It's June 26, 1995, and a team of federal responders is standing outside a small backyard shed in Clinton Township, Michigan, in full hazmat suits. Holding Geiger counters, reading numbers nobody expected in a quiet neighborhood, lined with above-ground pools and basketball hoops. 4 years earlier, that shed belonged to a 17-year-old Boy Scout working on a merit badge. This isn't a movie about a rogue government scientist or a Cold War spy. This is a kid with a chemistry set, a library card, and an obsession that got so far out of hand that EPA eventually classified his mother's backyard as a radioactive Superfund cleanup site. David Hahn was, by every normal metric, an unremarkable kid growing up in the Detroit suburbs in the 1980s, quiet, awkward, and obsessed with science. From age 10, David had one real interest that consumed him completely: chemistry. Not baking soda volcano chemistry, David wanted results. He read every science book the local library owned, sometimes multiple times, and started building his own basement laboratory as a preteen, working through experiments with a self-taught technical skill that startled the adults around him. His father viewed David's obsession less as a warning sign and more as a source of quiet pride. A brilliant, self-directed kid teaching himself graduate-level material with zero formal instruction. And David really was that talented. He memorized atomic weights for fun and could explain isotopic decay chains to adults twice his age, which made most of them assume he understood exactly where the line was. He did not. By age 14 in 1988, David had already synthesized nitroglycerin in that basement. A neighbor recalled a small explosion loud enough to rattle windows on the block, and David walked out afterward with singed eyebrows and the energy of a man who considered the experiment a success. David's parents had divorced years earlier, and he split time between two households, his father's with a stepmother and his mother's. In that kind of family chaos, where nobody had full visibility into what a teenager was doing behind a closed door, warning signs had a tendency to slip through the cracks. His stepmother eventually grew alarmed enough by chemical smells and small explosions to banish his experiments from the house, first to the garage, then to a small potting shed behind his mother's home in Clinton Township. Exactly the kind of unsupervised, low-visibility space a determined teenager needs to attempt something genuinely dangerous. In 1991, at age 15, David joined the Boy Scouts of America and set his sights on one of the organization's rarest badges, atomic energy, which required scouts to demonstrate an understanding of nuclear physics, typically by building a simple diorama of a reactor. Most scouts spend an afternoon with cardboard and poster board. David decided, with total sincerity, he was going to build a real one. His scoutmaster tried gently talking him out of it, pointing out the diorama version would satisfy every requirement. David listened politely, then ignored every word of it. Once the story became national news, the Boy Scouts fielded press questions about whether their own merit badge program had inspired a federal Superfund site. The atomic energy badge itself was eventually discontinued. You cannot simply walk into a hardware store and buy fuel for a nuclear reactor. So David did the next best thing available to a 15-year-old with a library card and patience. He read nuclear physics textbooks above his grade level, government pamphlets on radioactive materials, and technical literature on breeder reactors, machines designed to generate more usable fuel than they consume. He wrote real, typed letters to nuclear regulatory bodies, universities, and foreign embassies, posing as a physics teacher researching a classroom demonstration. Several wrote back with genuinely detailed technical responses, because who would suspect a Michigan high schooler with a teenager's handwriting of building anything more dangerous than a diorama? One federal nuclear regulatory office replied to his request for isotope information for educational purposes. Polite, informative, and utterly unaware, David Hahn, physics educator, was a 16-year-old at his mother's kitchen table. Nobody ever verified his identity. He kept the replies filed neatly by date and agency, the same obsessive habit that later made the federal investigation almost embarrassingly easy. David's actual genius was never nuclear physics in the academic sense. It was persistence in logistics. He understood that low-level radioactive material was scattered throughout an enormous range of ordinary consumer products sold on hardware store shelves and in mail-order catalogs for decades, before regulators phased them out. He became obsessive about identifying which everyday products contained trace radioactive elements, then about acquiring as many as possible. Over roughly 3 years, David worked his way through a mail order and small purchase supply chain nobody was watching. He wrote to companies claiming to be a science teacher requesting surplus materials for classroom use. Each individual item, taken alone, posed essentially no danger. Trace amounts, heavily diluted, sealed inside casings engineered to keep them that way. He kept meticulous, journal-style notes on every acquisition, cataloging sources, dates, and quantities. Precision that made the eventual federal investigation considerably easier. But David was not interested in a single item. He was interested in volume and had the patience of someone with nothing else pulling at his attention. A few people noticed in small, dismissible ways. A neighbor recalled him borrowing heavy work gloves for a project. A shopkeeper recalled a polite teenager buying unusual quantities of a household item, paying exact cash. None of it, on its own, looked like anything. Every individual purchase was small, boring, and legal enough that nobody connected the dots, until a federal health physicist eventually connected every one of them at once. Piece by piece, David began isolating and combining what he'd gathered, using self-taught chemistry techniques from that same basement lab. He built makeshift containment out of ordinary hardware store materials, lead sheeting, blocks, tools any adult could buy without a raised eyebrow. He worked mostly at night, alone, in a shed roughly the size of a garden closet. From the outside, it looked like every other backyard potting shed: peeling paint, a small window, a padlock nobody thought twice about. Inside, it had quietly become an unlicensed radiological workspace built from parts a teenager could source without a single background check. By junior year, his routine had settled into something unnervingly disciplined. Homework, dinner with the family, then hours alone in the shed after everyone else went to bed, working by lamplight with the door latched from inside. Classmates described someone polite, a little odd, and uninterested in typical teenage social life. His mother knew he had a lab out there. What she didn't know was exactly what lab had come to mean by summer 1994. She'd occasionally hear odd sounds at night, notice strange smells, and ask what he was doing. David gave vague, technically true-sounding answers about chemistry experiments, and she, like nearly everyone else in this story, took him at his word. By summer 1994, roughly 3 years in, David had assembled what he sincerely believed was the working core of a breeder reactor, a small shielded assembly meant to sustain a nuclear reaction on a miniature scale. He never achieved self-sustaining fission. The physics simply weren't there. What he did create was a small, homemade device that was measurably, seriously radioactive. The kind of setup that would send a professional Geiger counter needle straight into alarm within seconds. Radiation doesn't respect property lines or a teenager's homemade containment. In early 1994, according to accounts David later gave, a small fire broke out in the shed during a late-night session, extinguished within minutes, but enough to rattle him. Investigators later concluded that had the fire spread further, it could have released contaminated smoke as a serious neighborhood health event. More than a year before anyone in an official capacity knew what was happening, David told no one. He cleaned up, reinforced his setup, and kept going. By mid-1994, David noticed something wrong with himself. He was exhausted constantly, in a way sleep didn't fix. He developed sores that wouldn't heal, particularly around his mouth and chin. Cold and flu symptoms lingered for weeks. His hands took on a persistent redness he chalked up to ordinary chemical exposure. Anyone who understood early signs of radiation exposure would have recognized those symptoms immediately. David, deep in tunnel vision obsession, mostly couldn't through it. By August 1994, radiation readings from his shed climbed high enough that even David got nervous. Not primarily about his health, notably, but about getting caught. Worried neighbors or family might stumble onto what he'd built. David dismantled the bulk of his setup, packed the radioactive materials into his car trunk, and, in one of the worst decisions in a story full of them, drove around suburban Detroit for weeks, trying to figure out what to do with a trunk full of radioactive material he could no longer safely keep at home. He considered, by his own later account, dumping everything in a remote area and walking away for good. He never got the chance to make that call himself. A tire theft investigation beat him to it. The whole 3-year project came apart by the least dramatic method imaginable. On August 31st, 1994, police in Clinton Township pulled David over after reports of tire thefts in the area, a charge that had nothing to do with nuclear physics. Officers expected at most a few stolen rims. Instead, they found a locked metal toolbox David flatly refused to open, offering only vague warnings that it was dangerous. Suspicious, they forced it open anyway. Inside, a chaotic assortment of lab equipment, chemical containers, and unidentified metal components that meant nothing to a patrol officer trained for stolen tires, but worried them enough to call in backup and a hazardous materials specialist. Questioned on the spot, David told the officers the truth. He'd been building an atomic energy lab as a personal science project, a sentence that is technically accurate and yet somehow undersells the entire situation. One officer later described it as the strangest thing he'd heard in his career, delivered by a calm, polite teenager on the side of the road like he was explaining a school science fair project. The report eventually reached the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which sent a health physicist to formally assess the shed. He arrived expecting an overzealous kid with some contaminated junk. What he found made him back away within minutes and call for backup. His report cataloged materials and byproducts that painted a picture of a project far more advanced than anyone had suspected. Advanced enough that the case would later be cited in academic papers and regulatory reviews as a cautionary example of how easily unlicensed individuals could accumulate hazardous material through entirely legal, individually harmless purchases. Readings inside were elevated enough that officials concluded a fire could have exposed the surrounding neighborhood to dangerous radioactive contamination. This was a real, credible public health risk that had sat quietly in a Detroit suburb's backyard for the better part of a year. In the days before the cleanup, officials quietly evacuated David's mother and relocated her, while crews assessed the contamination. The EPA officially got involved in June 1995, nearly a year after the traffic stop, once the true scale became clear. Neighbors watching from their driveways assumed at first there had been a gas leak. Workers arrived in full hazmat suits, dismantled the shed piece by piece, and hauled it away as radioactive waste, sealed in barrels and transported to a licensed disposal facility out of state. The cleanup cost taxpayers an estimated $60,000, and the site officially received a government radioactive contamination designation, meaning a Boy Scout's backyard potting shed in suburban Michigan was, for a stretch of 1995, treated with the same procedural weight as an actual nuclear waste site. Within weeks, wire services picked up the story, and by the end of summer, David Hahn's name was running in newspapers across the country. One EPA on-scene coordinator described the shed's contamination levels as significantly higher than anything typically expected from a residential property, and noted the case was treated with the same procedures used for licensed industrial radioactive sites. David never actually got his merit badge. What he did eventually receive years later was quiet acknowledgement from people within the nuclear regulatory community that his self-taught understanding of reactor physics was more advanced than a typical high school student's. An assessment delivered around the same time federal agents were sealing the physical evidence of his life's work into barrels bound for permanent disposal. David joined the U.S. Navy in 1996, reportedly hoping to work with properly regulated nuclear equipment. He was discharged early once his radioactive history surfaced during background checks, long before he'd have gotten near real reactor equipment. He drifted through unrelated jobs over the following decade, never fully shaking the notoriety of being, quite literally, a walking government case study. In the years after his discharge, David dealt with health problems many close to him, attributed to years of prolonged, largely unshielded radiation exposure as a teenager, including visible marks on his face that lingered the rest of his life. The story might have faded from public memory, if not for journalist Ken Silverstein, who stumbled across the case while researching something else and tracked David down years later for a magazine feature. That reporting grew into a book published in 2007, The Radioactive Boy Scout, which turned David into a strange piece of American pop culture folklore. Reporters who interviewed him around the book's release describe a quiet, guarded man uncertain whether he should be proud or ashamed of what he'd built, who still lit up talking about isotopes in a way that suggested the obsession had never gone away. That same year, as the book brought his story back into public view, David was arrested again, this time for stealing smoke detectors from apartment building hallways, presumably chasing the same raw material he'd collected a decade earlier. He died in September 2016 at 39, from what an autopsy determined was an accidental overdose, his body reportedly still carrying physical marks consistent with years of radiation exposure that began, of all places, in a backyard potting shed behind his mother's house in suburban Michigan. The house still stands today. The shed obviously does not. What remains is the case file, a strange, uniquely American paper trail proving that for one summer in the mid-1990s, a Boy Scout with a library card and an unusual amount of patience genuinely, briefly, outmaneuvered an entire regulatory system built specifically to stop exactly that from happening. It remains one of the strangest true stories in modern American history, not a spy thriller, not a lab accident. Just a teenager, a shed, a super fun sight. So that's the story, and hopefully you walked away with something new today. If you enjoyed this, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and I've got a lot more stories like this one coming. Drop a comment and let me know what you think, or what topic you want covered next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.